Hi friends, Miss Liz here again. Today we're going to do the part one of making brioche dough. Brioche is something that is very particular. It has lots of fat because of the extra eggs that we put into it. We use we use milk as our base instead of water. Which gives it an extra level of richness. Those really nice soft breads that tear just beautifully are typically made with milk instead of water, which is what we're doing today. The process for this dough, we are going to get our ingredients incorporated, knead it a little bit until we get a nice smooth consistency, and then this is gonna chill in the refrigerator for at least 8 hours. So if you're making it in the evening, it'll be ready to bake in the morning. Up to 24 hours in the refrigerator. Just makes it, number one, a lot easier to work with. When it's been nice and chilled, it becomes less tacky because we don't want to over dry our brioche dough. Otherwise, we're not going to have that beautiful softness to it. So be prepared to make this dough and have plenty of time for it to rest in your refrigerator. Just a couple of things. Make sure your milk is nice and warm, not too hot. If your liquid is hot, you will kill your yeast, and we don't want to do that. So make sure that your milk is nice and warm, but not hot. Also, as you add your ingredients, I'm going to switch to 2 different attachments. I'm going to start with the whisk to get all of my liquid ingredients incorporated, mix my eggs, and then I'll be switching to a dough hook so that I can knead the dough more smoothly. And then last thing, make sure your butter is nice and soft, very, very soft. Not liquid, but nice and soft. You're able to smush it, is what you're looking for, okay? So to start with, I have my milk, half a cup of milk, again, warm, but not hot. And I'm just gonna put that into my mixer bowl. And then into that, I'm gonna add my yeast. Now, if you're using yeast that comes in a jar or in a large batch, you're gonna use about 2 1/4, 2 1/2 teaspoons. If you're using yeast that comes in the strips of packets, it's just one of these little squares. And you're just going to take that yeast, add it right into your nice warm milk. And then we're also going to add in our honey, about 2 teaspoons of honey. If you're not exactly sure, you can go ahead and use actual teaspoon measurement. If you have a squirt top on your honey, you can do just basically 2 short squirts, 1, 2, and that should be about 2 teaspoons. You can use a teaspoon measurement if you want, but it doesn't have to be exact for the honey. What we're doing is we're giving the yeast something to eat as it activates in that warm milk. So I'm just going to turn this on for a second, give it a little stir. And then we're gonna let that rest so that that yeast can get nice and activated. This is a little bit different than when we make our regular sandwich bread. We want that yeast to really come to life before we start adding a lot of other things. So we're really gonna let this rest for 5 to 10 minutes before we add anything else. Okay, so we've let the yeast rest. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna add the eggs. I have 5 whole eggs and 1 yolk from an egg. That extra yolk is giving us that extra richness, that extra fat that we want. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn on my mixer and I'm just gradually gonna pour these eggs in. And we're just gonna let that stir for a few minutes, make sure all of that egg gets broken up and fairly mixed before we add the next ingredients. All right, so I've got those eggs. It's got a really pretty yellow color. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna add our vanilla, which is gonna be 2 teaspoons. 2 teaspoons of vanilla. We're gonna add our white sugar, which is gonna be 5 tablespoons. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 tablespoons. We're gonna mix that just a little bit before we add our flour and our salt. Now this recipe is very interesting because we're gonna add our flour and our salt until it gets kind of scraggly, and then we're gonna add in the butter at the end to help smooth out the texture. So just gonna turn this on and mix in the vanilla and the sugar first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off this whisk attachment, and I'm going to switch to a dough hook before I add my flour. Now the flour measurement is based on the weight, and so the closest approximation to the weight is 4 cups and 2 tablespoons, okay? Now, when you scoop flour, it's very, very important that you keep your flour light and airy. We don't want to over measure because then our cup will be too heavy, which means it's not an accurate cup. So sifting is the best method. One option is to take a second scoop and fill, and then if you have excess, brush it off. Don't pack the flour back in, okay? So we're going to do 4 cups, lightly measured. You can kind of sprinkle with a second cup or a spoon. Nice and level. 2. 3. And 4. And then that 2 tablespoons. Again, make sure you keep it light and airy. Don't pack your flour. You can kind of shuffle it to make sure it's nice and loose before you scoop it. Just like that. And then before I mix that, I'm going to go ahead and add the salt. Now, one mistake that people tend to make when they're working with yeast is that they add the salt directly to the yeast mixture before they add the flour, and salt can be abrasive, especially if you're using a sea salt. So it's better to add some of your flour first and then add your salt so that you create a protective barrier so that your salt doesn't damage your yeast. So we're going to do 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Okay. And then I'm just going to mix this until it becomes nice and scraggly, kind of like a shaggy texture. Okay, so what we're looking for now, your dough should have a nice kind of shaggy texture. You've probably got a little bit of flour left that needs to be worked in, and that's okay. We're going to start gradually adding our butter until it becomes nice and smooth. So at this point, I've let this mix for a few minutes. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this on. And I'm going to take all of my butter here and I'm going to divide it kind of into 4 sections. Doesn't have to be perfectly equal. But I'm going to turn this on and I'm going to add 1 section and then let it mix for a few minutes. Add another section, let it mix for a few minutes. Do that until all of that butter has been incorporated, and it's going to need for several minutes, a good 10 minutes, really letting that mixer do the work for you. we're looking for now, when we pull this dough off, it should feel kind of tacky, but it shouldn't peel off on your fingers. If it's still very soupy looking in the bottom of your bowl, or you can't really touch it, then you need a little bit more flour. So just gradually add about 1/4 of a cup at a time and mix it in so that after it's kneaded for several minutes, you can kind of gather it into a ball. And you might get a little bit off on your fingers, but if it's very, very gooey, then you need a little bit more flour until you have a fairly workable consistency, okay? So what you'll want to do then, we're gonna shape this into a lightly floured ball on the counter, and then we're gonna put it back in the bowl and let it rise for about 1 hour at room temp. And then we're gonna punch it down, reshape it into a ball, and then it's gonna go into your refrigerator, okay? So I'm gonna show you how we're gonna shape this really quick. I'm gonna pull up my sleeve here. What I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna take a little bit of flour on my counter, just like this. And I'm gonna just dump this out on top of that flour right there, okay? If you have a little bit of excess stuck in the bowl, you can scrape that off. Put it on your lump of dough. And then you're just gonna take it by the edges and kind of fold all of those edges in, like you're tucking the outsides into the center, okay? We're not gonna overly knead it, mostly just making sure it's got a nice floured, so when we flip it over, we've got a nice smooth top with some flour on it, okay? Just like that. And we're gonna put this back into the bowl and let it rise for about 1 hour at room temp. And then we're gonna punch it back down, knead it out again exactly like we just did, and then it's gonna go into the refrigerator for a minimum of 8 hours.